Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Lindsay. Welcome to E-commerce Marketing with the Pitbulls, where we try to cut through the noise and simplify digital marketing for authentic brands looking to make more sales online.
Great. I'm really excited for today's conversation. We are joined by Bet Hannon, who is the CEO and founder of Accessicart. So, Bet, why don't you introduce yourself, give us a little bit of background about what Accessicart does.
Right, so we focus on e-commerce and accessibility for people with disabilities. And when e-commerce, but more broadly, anything that has a high user engagement. So what e-commerce, of course, people have to fill out forms. There's a checkout, all of those kinds of things. And so all of those are places. Are typically places where you might find some problems with accessibility on a website. So they tend to get sued a little bit more often, and or want to gain those customers for sure. So
That's awesome. Yeah, I know we spend a lot of time thinking about friction in the checkout process, and I think this is just kind of one more area of that probably gets overlooked pretty frequently.
yeah, I try to tell people really a good way to think about accessibility is to think about it as optimizing user experience for a little bit wider group of people.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. And you mentioned before we kind of dive into accessibility in and out, just kind of teeing up, the importance of it. You mentioned being sued there. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Sure. So if you are in the US, well, if you have customers in the US, so like privacy law, laws around web accessibility deal with where the user lives, so or the customer lives. And so if you have customers in the US, then your site has to comply with Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. A lot of people have heard about ADA and they think about it primarily in terms of physical spaces like brick and mortar stores, but increasingly over the last 15 years or so, there have been more lawsuits around ADA and websites. And just last year, the Justice Department said, yes, websites do fall under ADA. There's a little bit of ambiguity about how do you meet that compliance. It's not like when you have you have to have these kind of parking spaces or these kinds of doorways, but so it's a little bit different, but we're moving toward that and getting more and more of that. But in the meantime, in the US, what we're left with is people suing you because your site is not accessible. In other countries, they also have accessibility laws. So if you have customers in Canada or the EU or Australia, they also have rights around things being accessible. And typically in those other countries, there's not the lawsuits. People file a complaint, and it's the government that enforces that, and you get a fine. And so just a little bit different processes, but it all boils down to if you're making money off your website, it's pretty much a slam dunk that you need to be paying attention to accessibility.
Definitely. Yeah. It seems like it would be really important. One, just obviously, making sure that you are accessible and that you're as many people as possible can get to the site and engage with your brand. But two, that legal ramifications just add that extra bit of urgency to it all.
It is a kind of thing that I think motivates people to start thinking about accessibility. That's often a really common thing, right? People have heard about somebody getting sued or they've gotten sued themselves. And so, I think it is a really common thing to start from that place, but then kind of growing beyond that to say, well, I want to, it's the right thing to do. I mean, there's certainly a moral argument for not excluding anybody, but also kind of moving into thinking about all the business positive ways, and we could talk about that. I should say, just in terms of U.S., folks with U.S. customers, the first step usually, if you're going to get sued, is that you would get what's called a demand letter. So you get a letter from an attorney on behalf of the plaintiff who has a disability that they intend to sue you. And sometimes these can really look like junk mail, and sometimes they are, you would think a letter from an attorney might look professional, but a lot of times they're not. And so some of them can be these predatory lawsuits where one attorney, one plaintiff are suing many, many people. that doesn't mean that they aren't real and that you shouldn't take them seriously. And so if you get a letter like that, it's important to contact your attorney or an attorney that deals with these sorts of matters. Take it seriously. A lot of times you can, it can be less costly if you settle that up front rather than going to court over it. But if you just toss it and don't pay any attention to it, the next thing that comes to you is a summons to appear in court. And so that starts to get really costly. So
Definitely, I can imagine.
And now that we've sufficiently gained everyone's attention by
yes,
scaring them a bit, I think it'd
everybody's
be
on
great
tenterhooks.
yeah. Well, no. So now that we've got that, what would you say from just like a business owner coming to you saying, like, what is accessibility when it comes to my website? What are the pieces that they have to be thinking about around this?
Yeah, so one piece is that the CDC in the US and the UN more globally says that about 25% of all adults everywhere have some disability that requires an accommodation. That's so that includes everybody from people who are blind to people who have, have a mobility impairment, they can't use a mouse, to people who are colorblind. I mean, we begin to talk about dealing with a whole spectrum of things, including, ADHD and reading disabilities, other kinds of things. Even, we work with, as we're working with e-commerce books, we even begin to think about anxiety and depression that cause people to give up too quick, right? If your checkout process is convoluted and takes a long time and seems never ending, people will bounce because they're just giving up. And so beginning to think about how can you make changes to your site so that all of those different types of people can use it. So it begins to look practically like this. So people, and as I go around talking to people about these kinds of things, a lot of times people have just never really given any thought to how people with disabilities would use the web. And so there's a kind of a curiosity on the one hand, and so people who are blind or who have a severe visual impairment use what's called a screen reader. And it's a bit of software that lives on their machine, and it will read out loud to them the website, not just the text content on the page, but it'll read out if there are descriptions on the images, which there should be. It will read out the link text. So they can look at link text. They can tell the screen reader to only read out the H2 headings on the page. So there are ways that a screen reader reads out loud to them things. If a person can't use a mouse, they often have what's some kind of an adaptive device. So like Stephen Hawking had a little, as he became more and more paralyzed, had a little sensor on his, he wore on his glasses for his cheek, right? He could move a cheek muscle. And really, all of those devices are very individualized to the person's limitations and abilities, but they all come down to keyboard navigation. So testing, you don't have to like accommodate 1,000 different devices. You just have to make sure your site is keyboard navigatable. And that's true for people who are blind and screen reader users too. They're using keyboard navigation to move around in your website. So you can just go to your site and you can start pressing tab and enter and see how far you can navigate through your site, right? Because those are the keys that'll, you may not have known that, right? The tab key would just move you through things on your website. And then, we begin to look at things like, people who have reading disabilities, if you full justify text so that it's even on both margins, it creates what are called rivers of white through the text, because the person with the reading disability may see the white and not the words, right? And so you don't want to it's simple things like that sometimes, right? Just don't full justify something. But making sure that you're using colors properly, right? You want to have, you don't want to make your link text just be a color indicator, because the person who is colorblind might not ever see that, right? You want to underline it or make it bold as well as give it a color, right? So things like that are what you would, the sorts of things that you would want to do to try and make your site more friendly for people with disabilities. The place that you can go to begin to learn all of those sort of guidelines for things is called the Website Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. And it's pretty technical, but if you have a developer team or you work with folks that are helping you, that's a great resource for them. There are we're on level 2.0 now. And there are 3 levels of that: single A, double A, triple A. Double A is generally where everyone is focusing their efforts on all of that. And so, in some ways, it doesn't really change your website too obviously for people who are sighted or who have no disabilities, but it can really make a difference to those customers that have some disabilities.
Yeah,
So
and oh, go ahead, Andy.
I was just going to say, when you're getting started, so you've got new, especially e-commerce client comes to you. What are like some of the you mentioned some of the areas, but what are like the give us the top couple mistakes that you see on a lot of e-commerce sites?
Yeah. So the big 3 are having alt text on your images, and when we say helpful alt text. And so remember, the screen reader is reading that out loud, so you don't want to jam pack that super long necessarily, but you're wanting to be thoughtful about giving enough pieces. We have a post on our blog about writing alt text for products, because that's a product images are kind of a special case, so you might want to think about that. So alt text, using the heading structure on the page properly. So a lot of times people are using the headings to style text and make it different sizes or different, and really the headings, that's really about giving the meaning. And so you want to think about those headings as almost like the outline you used to do in high school English, right? Like the Roman numeral 1, and then you indent the letter A, and then you have a small Roman numeral and then a lowercase. So all of that kind of nesting, that's what headings are supposed to do. So you have one and only one H1, and generally that's the title or the title of the product. And then you have H2, and then you would never skip from an H2 to an H4 or 5. Right? So you want to make sure. So in reality, the text of that heading can be styled any way you want, but the H factor, whether it's a 2 or 3 or 4, is telling the screen reader, but also Google, where that content is in terms of its meaning on the page. And it's kind of important because, like, a screen reader user will have their screen reader, read me all the H2s, and so they just surfing through, just like sighted people do. We're skimming through, right, to look at what's most relevant to us, right? That's how they're skimming too, is read me all the H2s. Now read me all the H3s under that H2, so that they can narrow down quickly on what they're looking for. So alt text, using heading and other semantic things properly, right? If you put a data table in, it needs to have the HTML for data table tags in it, that kind of stuff. Don't use a hyphen for making a bullet, right? Use a proper bulleted list, those kinds of things. So alt text, semantic HTML headings, and then making sure you're getting your color contrast right, like just looking at color contrast. If you deal with those, this has to do with the color of the font on the, with the button behind, or the color of the font and its background. And there are some color contrast checkers you can look at. The amount of the contrast varies depending on the size of the font. So you want to make sure that, you can look at that and kind of get a sense for, if it's small font, it's got to be really high contrast. If it's a bigger font, maybe it doesn't have to be as much contrast. But getting that color contrast right, if you do all of those 3, that's about 80% of all web accessibility issues. And most of those really don't need a developer to work with. Really, a lot of that can be, the site owner, or if they're not a developer, working on those. But if you've got a store with 10,000 products and you never put any alt tags, text into your images, that's a lot of work to go back for. And so I would say the most important thing in that kind of a case is really educate yourself and start creating accessible content, so that you're not, at least you're not creating more work for your future self, right? So.
I'm curious, as we talk about this, I think it kind of sounded like, or maybe you alluded to a little bit, but I'm curious how this ties into like SEO even. So we're talking about obviously how human can read through everything, but as we're going through, especially some of that like hierarchical HTML, I'm curious like what effects and what improvements I can give you from an SEO
Oh,
perspective.
you almost always improve your SEO when you're improving accessibility because of that structured piece, right? And you're getting that semantic structure in there. The alt text as well is important for SEO. You want to make sure you're not just sort of keyword stuffing in the alt text, but that it's genuine because the Google algorithms are now looking, is that genuinely helpful information about your image, right? And so, making sure you're doing that, you're almost always improving your SEO. And actually, the same is true for user experience, right? Anytime you improve accessibility for people with disabilities, you improve the user experience for everybody because, if a lot of times people are just have situational, impairment, right, in a sense, right? I have a wiggly baby on my hip and I'm trying to navigate your website. This is important for you, Andy, right? Because you're going to have another baby, right? You've got a
Exactly.
wiggly, got babies that you're juggling and you're trying to navigate, or you're out in the sunlight on your phone, right? And so the contrast needs to be high. You almost always improve the user experience for everybody when you make your site accessible. And actually, it's kind of true. A lot of technology improvements that were originally intended to improve life for people with disabilities be, become things that make life better for all of us. So we often use the example of curb cuts, right? Curb cuts are for people with wheelchairs or scooters or that kind of thing. But if you're pushing your baby stroller or you're dragging your luggage, right? We all love those curb cuts. Same for like AI assistants like Alexa and Google Voice and all of those, right? All of that technology originally developed to help people with disabilities. And so we all get to benefit from all of that.
Yeah, I love the example. Before we hopped on here, you were telling us about the having captions on the video, and obviously there's a big accessibility tie to that. But I forget the percentage you had thrown out there, but a very high percentage of people are watching videos with sound off as well. So it really helps everybody.
It does. It really does. Yeah.
So if I'm a business and I'm thinking about this now, it kind of makes me think how interesting this is that likely a lot of business owners don't interact with any of these kind of accessibility issues in their daily life. So they're not going to be thinking about it for their website or their business in general until they're going to get sued, or if they have a brick and mortar store, they're thinking about the ADA. So if there's someone who doesn't have those kind of accessibility thoughts in their daily life, who can they go to? What are some resources that business owners can utilize to make their website more accessible?
Right. Right. And so I can't remember whether we mentioned it yet or not, but CDC says about 25% of all adults have some issue. So just because you don't know someone or you don't think about that, it doesn't mean that it's not out there and that there's you can widen your audience, right? So as a part of becoming more accessible. So that's important. And in reality, all of us are just one accident or illness away from some kind of disability. Um, so there are some resources out there. There are agencies like ours that can help you with what's called an audit. So we have people on like our team, and not just us. I mean, there are other places out there too that will help you do some testing on your site to help you find the accessibility issues. So you may be able to do some of that testing yourself, kind of DIY at the beginning. And definitely, you probably know whether you need to add alt text to your images already, right? If you haven't been doing that. You may want to. You can do some of that self-testing. Although what we find is there are some online tools to do that. One of them is called Wave, WAVE, .webaim, .org, I think is there. I can't remember if it's .com or .org, but Wave, the Wave tool. What we find is that while you get those AI generated tests, so there's some automation testing that can happen. But what happens is that AI both gives you false positives and false negatives. So sometimes it will tell you have a color contrast issue when you have an image background, but because the AI can't see the image background, it it doesn't, it's telling you have a color contrast issue when you really don't. Conversely, there are just some things that AI can't test for, so it can't tell you that you have that your menu is not navigatable with the keyboard. right? There's no way for AI to test for that. And so it can also it's just really hard, I think, for site owners to look at those tools and know how to make sense of them and to know what to do next. And that's where agencies like ours can help, is that we can help you do that testing, and then we can help you prepare a plan and say, look, this issue impacts a lot of people. Or, folks like me that say, look, 95 or more percent of all of the lawsuits that come are for e-commerce sites, and 77% of all of those, of all ADA website lawsuits are e-commerce, right? So huge percentage. Um, and of those, 95% of them are people who are blind, right? So if you're worried about your legal liability, then you probably want to like deal with those issues first. Not, don't stop there, because other people still can, like you want to include other people too, but that's the place to start, right? So people can help you prioritize those pieces. So when you get an audit done, typically you are not getting your whole site audited. Usually, unless you have a very small site, that is cost prohibitive to do that. So you're usually getting what's called a sample audit. So we would work with a client, and the way we do it is that we would help the client pick a representative number of URLs or views, right? Sometimes the view on the page changes even though the URL doesn't change in like a checkout form or something. But a URL or a view, and we package those at 10, 20, and 30. And so we would identify what those are. We would do the testing, then you get a report. And the testing is using some of those automated tools, but you want to make sure, if you're going to get an audit and pay for it, that you are having some human testing done. It's just, as we talked about, there are just some things that the tools can't test for. And a lot of accessibility has contextual pieces to it, right? You would want to do this in this particular kind of situation, and in a different sort of context, you would do it this different way, right? And so some of that human testing is super important. So you get a report, and then we tend to offer as well then an hour of consulting. So then often the client will bring their regular development team or the agency that they typically work with to that meeting. We can answer some technical questions and do more consultation more on a more technical basis with them. Or sometimes it's just meeting with the site owner and helping them learn what they need to do, self-serve or DIY.
I love that.
Yeah.
What about some of these like tools, or I've seen like apps that you can install that supposedly just will, give you better accessibility out of the gate? Do any of those work, or what should we know about those?
Yeah. So, well, the first thing to know is that they are flush with venture capital, so their ads are everywhere. And so, if the Google overlords know that you have an e-commerce store, you're surely seeing them. And so they might be uh, these are called overlay plugins. Some names that you might have seen are Accessibly or Userway or AudioEye. And what they are is that you put a little bit of code in your site. In a Shopify site, it might be in the theme. In a WordPress site, it might be in a plugin. And what it does is it sort of pulls in a script from their AI service and tries to fix or overlay the problem with a more accessible solution from as the site visitor is there and chooses the tools. So there's actually a number of problems with those pieces. The best place to go for all the information, all the things, is called overlayfactsheet.com. Overlayfactsheet.com. But among the problems are if a person has a disability and they need a particular tool, usually they already have it installed on their machine because they need it for the other 99% of the websites on the web, right? And what happens is that the tool that you have sitting there potentially conflicts with their tool and renders neither tool working. So now they can't use their preferred tool either. And so a lot of times there are people with disabilities will install a browser extension to block your tool. So that's one, it's not helping the people you think it's going to help. Two, it actually can only deal with things that AI can help, right? It can't make your menu navigatable by keyboard because it can't detect that you have a problem, and that's not something that can be um, overridden, right? In the same way. And so there are things that they don't fix. There are increasingly some, we're seeing anecdotally, but it's increasing, that because people can, look at the tech stack you're using, they can actually target you for using these things, that the predatory lawsuits are beginning to target people using these
Mm.
overlays, because it's pretty easy to say, well, they knew they should have been doing something about accessibility, but they didn't fix this thing, right? Um, and also, how they work is there's a little widget on your site, and when the person clicks it, then they have to click what helpful tool they would like to use. Well, if they say they want, for instance, screen magnification, we are seeing evidence that the service, so like the company that you're working with, um, takes that information and stores it with that user's IP address, ostensibly so that the next time that user goes to another site with that tool, they can already have it enabled for them. But that's taking HIPAA protected information about their healthcare status, and nobody is being notified that it's being stored, and you don't have a way to remove it. And the site, yeah, it's putting the site owner at risk in terms of some country privacy laws. And so a kind of a whole plethora of and they don't stand with you when you're sued, right? A lot of people see the ads or interpret the ads as, oh, I just have to do this and then I'm scot free. And then when you get sued, that company points you to the user, the license agreement that where you signed off that you understood that they were not going to stand with you and defend you in court. So, so problematic, not best practice. Um, the best case, I think the best use case for them would be if you have been sued, you're having to make your site accessible, like on a dime as a part of a court settlement or a court case, and you're working on it, but it's just taking a while to get that done. It's not going to satisfy the court thing, but might get you a little bit of time to get some things made accessible.
That makes
Those-
sense. Yeah, it's really interesting with all this stuff. There's like all the reasons why you should do it anyway, but then on top of that, just you could get sued too.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up, Andy, because I was wondering the exact same thing, and I've seen these plugins everywhere. I wanted to ask, I know that you mentioned that sometimes these costs can be prohibitive for businesses to dive in and start working on this. Are there any breaks that they can get, or is there any help out there in terms of cost?
Yeah, so one of them is that there is a tax, a non-refundable tax credit that U.S.-based businesses can get. So if your business is based in the U.S., to qualify, you have to have less than 30 employees or less than $1 million in revenue. So not everybody qualifies, but certainly that's going to help a lot of small business. And it's one or the other, right? So you can have 5 million in revenue if you have less than 30 employees, you still qualify. And this qualifies anything that you do to make your website more accessible. So that can range from getting an audit done, having, we say remediation is the word we use, fixing the accessibility issues, having a completely new site redesigned with the accessibility as one of the factors for that. Everything up to the tax credit is for up to $10,000 in expenses. You can get 50% of that back as a credit. Now you don't get money back, but that reduces the amount that you owe on other things. You have to pay it all up front and then get the credit on the next year's taxes. So.
That should
But
definitely
it's
be
a
helpful.
great thing,
Yeah.
right? That's pretty amazing kind of break. So
Yeah,
Definitely.
oh, right.
and then depending on how folks want to work on things, there are, in terms of spreading, there are ways to spread out some of the cost for doing that. We are not the only agency that does this, but there are agencies where you can purchase sort of instead of outlaying a chunk of money on an audit that's going to find a bunch of things, and then sort of paying your developers to, paying a developer to fix it, which, that's two big costs right there. There are ways to um, get a package where you buy a certain number of hours for auditing and remediation every month for a certain number, for at least, usually like ours have a certain minimum number of months for them. And people often go beyond that when they need to kind of keep doing the work. But that's a way to kind of spread out the costs for some of the remediation work. And
Yeah, I like that. I like your suggestion earlier too. Like, hey, even if you can't get everything done all together, like at least start now. Like make sure any new content you're putting or new product pages you're putting
yeah,
out are
yeah,
correct so that that's one less thing you have to go back and fix later.
yeah. And I should say with those either with those kind of a plan package or any of those other things that we talked about in terms of the tax credit, that tax credit is not one time. You can kind of, now I assume at some level there is a there's probably a limit somewhere, but it's my understanding that you can claim it more than once as long as it's legitimately things that you're doing to work at making the website more accessible. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
So this has been really helpful. I think we touched on a lot of different accessibility items.
Yeah.
Is there anything we missed or any questions that you wish we had asked?
Oh, that's a really good. I think in many ways, making your website more accessible can be a really great investment in your brand. I do think I don't want I don't want it to seem political, but I do think people do respect um, the values of companies that try to be inclusive, and it's inclusive around people with disabilities. And so I would say if you work at making your website accessible, you want to figure out some ways to make that a part of your brand. And one of the ways that we advise clients to do that is to put an accessibility statement in the, and we just usually put it right down in the footer with the privacy policy kind of link down there. And the statement typically says three things. One, it says we want, it's a value statement at one level, right? We want everybody to be able to use this website. Right? We want to include everybody. Two, some statement about we particularly want to include people with disabilities, and we're striving to meet, you don't have to be specific, but we're striving to meet these guidelines, or we just want to include people with disabilities. And then an acknowledgement, the third, that website accessibility is well, it's never one and done, right? There's a level of maintenance to it. Anytime you make a change to the website, anytime you put a new product in, anytime you update the site, potentially it can go out of compliance, right? So there's a kind of an acknowledgement that we've worked at this, but you might still find something that's not accessible. If so, let us know. And then of course you have to like be responsive to that. But I think that can go a long way toward creating this sense of, yeah, we don't want to exclude anybody, right? And I think that can be a great investment in the brand. So
I love that. Yeah, we really try to focus on working with what we call craft brands, but oftentimes it's purpose-driven brands and there's a mission behind it. And I think that really probably aligns with the values of everybody that we're typically working with. That inclusivity is not something to be overlooked, obviously.
yeah, actually. And to be honest, I think uh, like some other communities at the margins, when the people with disabilities discover like an e-commerce shop that is inclusive, they are pretty vocal about sharing that around, right? You will find, and it's not then just your people with disabilities, but you get that reach for their friends and family members and the other people that care about them, because it is inclusive of them. And
That's great.
conversely, I mean, that can work the other way too, right? If you're excluding if I have some choices and maybe I don't, if I'm paying attention to that, I want to support the brands that are going to help my friends with disabilities live, full independent lives with full of human dignity. So yeah.
Love it.
That's a
Yeah.
great point. I love that, with especially who would have thought to create brand evangelists in this way? I'm sure that there are so many brands out there when they find out, oh, you actually make my life easier and I can use your website and I can buy things when I want to. It's just so much better. And like you said, sharing with friends and family too, who will support as well. It's got
the
great
number
reach.
of sites that they encounter on a daily basis that are not accessible, when they do encounter one that's accessible, it's really kind of a thing to be celebrated in their eyes. So that's great.
Are there any Shopify themes that are particularly good or particularly bad from an accessibility standpoint?
Not so much particular that I'm themes that I'm sure there are, right? But the thing that we have noticed and paid attention to, and I know that the Shopify team tries, it's difficult when you have a platform that large, right, to begin to try and deal with things. But there is a problem on the checkout option that is 2 columns on the page.
Okay.
And so where the left column asks them to start putting in their, their name and address and some stuff. If you start tabbing through that page, and it's just going from field to field, and it goes down. But on the other side, you have the coupon code and the cart. If you keep tabbing, it goes down the first column and down into the footer and down to the next, the next go to shipping, I think is the next thing, go to shipping, and then down into the footer to the privacy policy. So the blind person says, I've gone too far. I don't know where the coupon code is. Let me go back, right? And so they can't find the coupon code. Right? If they have
really interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
All it takes to fix that is, the platform can't fix it, but you can just switch to the one page checkout, right? To where it just takes you a page and you go to the next page, and that's a problem. Sometimes checkout for options that fly in, those are problematic. Or if somebody has embedded the kind of pop-up widget in another website where you're popping it up and you're buying the projects there, often those are not super accessible. And in a lot of e-commerce, there are things in the base platform, whether that's Shopify or WooCommerce or BigCommerce, that are mostly accessible out of the box. But then when you start adding additional things on, whether that's themes or add-ons or plugins or other custom coding, right? Sometimes the things that your developers do can make things then things get less accessible. So that's, but the shopping cart would be the typical, where you would see a lot of accessibility issues. So.
It's a great thing to look out for, definitely. Yeah. Well, awesome, Bet. I think this has been super, super helpful. I feel like I've learned a lot, and definitely just a really interesting topic that we don't get to talk about nearly enough, probably. So for all of our listeners out there, where can they find you and hear more about Accessicart?
Yeah, so best place to find me is at accessicart.com. So ACCESSICART.com. And I'm still on Twitter mostly at Bet Hannon. But I see people leaving that platform all the time. So, but we have a contact form at accessicart.com, and that's a good place to reach out as well. And happy to, I'm in a few groups, Shopify groups and WordPress group, WooCommerce groups and all around Facebook and LinkedIn. And
awesome. Yeah, we're always on LinkedIn. Come on out to LinkedIn. You can come on over from Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bet, for sharing all of this incredible information. Like Andy said, I feel like I went to school and I'm hoping to pass the test next time it comes around. So thank you for that.
It was so great being with you. Thanks for inviting me. I really had a good time. So
awesome. And if you liked what you heard today, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, get notified when new episodes come out. If you're ready to take the next step in your digital marketing journey, go ahead and check out ppcpitbulls.com/assessment, and you can take our digital marketing maturity assessment and reach out to us there, and we'll help you determine your next best step. So make sure you come back and get some more gems of wisdom like we had today with Bet. We thank you so much, Bet. We appreciate you. And we'll see you all next time.